My brother's hand was already on the $15 million estate papers when Mom smiled and said, "It's all yours." Dad didn't look at Luke. He looked at me. "Don't make a scene, Nora." I almost laughed. I wasn't the one giving $15 million to one child while asking the other to sit quietly and watch. So I said nothing. Then Daniel Mercer pulled the papers out from under my brother's hand. "There's a problem," he said. Luke frowned. "What problem?" Daniel turned one page toward me. My name was printed beneath two words I had not expected to see. Continuing guarantor. My fingers went cold against the edge of the conference table. Daniel looked at Luke first, then at my father. "The ownership transfer can still be documented," he said. "But the refinancing package attached to this transaction cannot close on the current terms without Miss Whitmore's signature." For the first time that morning, Luke looked at me instead of the papers. Dad's jaw tightened. And that was when I understood something that frightened me far more than losing Foxfield. My parents weren't simply giving my brother a $15 million estate. They were expecting me to help finance what came next. Foxfield estate had been in my family for 43 years. My grandfather bought the first 200 acres when the property was still mostly pasture and an aging stone house outside Middleburg, Virginia. My father expanded it into an equestrian facility, then added weddings, corporate events, and a newer pavilion that Mom insisted made Foxfield a destination instead of a farm. By the time I was 39, appraisers were putting the property's value somewhere around $15 million. That was the number everyone kept repeating that morning. 15 million. As though saying it often enough could make everyone forget the debt sitting underneath it. Or, apparently, the daughter whose name was still attached to part of that debt. Daniel Mercer sat at the head of the polished walnut table. He was not my lawyer. He had made that clear when I arrived. He represented the Foxfield ownership entity for purposes of the transfer documents. That distinction suddenly mattered a great deal. Mom sat beside Luke in a cream suit she wore whenever she wanted photographs to look timeless. Dad was across from me, his reading glasses folded beside his hand even though he had barely glanced at the documents. Luke had come in 10 minutes late. Nobody mentioned it. I had arrived 4 minutes early, and Mom had still asked whether traffic had been a problem again. Some family rules were so old, no one had to say them aloud. Luke was busy. I was difficult. Luke needed support. I could handle things. Daniel tapped the page in front of him. "The proposed ownership transfer and the refinancing are related in the current closing package," he said. "But legally they're separate components. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore can proceed with transferring their ownership interest if the governing documents permit it. What cannot happen as drafted is the new financing." Luke leaned back. "So what does Nora have to do with my financing?" The word "my" landed exactly where I expected it to. Daniel didn't react. "Miss Whitmore remains a guarantor under the existing Foxfield lending structure. The proposed facility assumes continuity of that guarantee." Dad waved one hand. "It's paperwork." I looked at him. He still wasn't looking at the page. That bothered me more than if he had been studying it. Most people who discovered an unexpected obstacle in a $15 million transaction asked questions. Dad was annoyed, not confused. I pulled the document closer. At work, I managed operational and financial risk for a regional logistics company. My days were filled with contracts, vendor exposure, insurance limits, debt covenants, continuity plans, and the quiet little sentences people ignored until those sentences became expensive. I knew the difference between an acknowledgement and an obligation, and I knew what the word continuing meant. "How much is the new facility?" I asked. Dad answered before Daniel could. "Nora." I kept my eyes on Daniel. "What's the total proposed borrowing?" Daniel gave the number. It was higher than I expected. Not catastrophically higher, but high enough that my attention sharpened. Foxfield already carried debt. That wasn't a secret. Properties like ours didn't operate on fairy dust and family pride. There were buildings, payroll, maintenance, insurance, horses, staff housing, event infrastructure, and years when the weather decided whether an outdoor season made money. But the number Daniel gave me was more than I would have expected for a simple refinance of the existing balance. I flipped to the next page. Dad exhaled through his nose. "For God's sake, Nora. This is exactly what I meant. What did you mean? Don't turn this into one of your audits. Mom placed a hand lightly on Luke's arm. It's his day. I looked at her. For 39 years, Mom had possessed a remarkable ability to make my questions sound like weapons. I lowered my eyes to the paper again. Then nobody should have put my name in his day. Silence. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. In my family, that was enough to count as rebellion. Luke pushed his chair back slightly. Can we just fix this? Daniel said. If Miss Whitmore is willing to execute the required guarantee documents, the financing portion can proceed through the remaining lender conditions. How long after closing before funds are available? Luke asked. My eyes lifted. Daniel gave a cautious answer about funding conditions and timing. Luke nodded impatiently. I stopped hearing the rest for a moment. Funds. Not ownership. Not title. Funds. Nobody had told me this morning was supposed to unlock cash. Dad had called 3 weeks earlier and said he and Mom had finally decided to simplify the succession. His word. Succession. Foxfield would go to Luke because, according to Dad, Luke had built his adult life around the property. That was generous. Luke owned an event equipment company 40 minutes away and spent most weekends at Foxfield when one of his clients was using the venue. I had built my adult life around making sure the family didn't drown whenever someone else's plan went wrong. Apparently that counted for less. I turned another page. Are you signing? Luke asked. I looked up. He said it the way someone might ask if I was finished using a pen. Not whether I had agreed. Whether I was done delaying them. I'm reviewing it. His mouth tightened. Dad picked up his glasses, then put them down again. Nora, you've already guaranteed Foxfield for years. That doesn't mean I automatically guarantee a new facility. It's the same property. It's not the same loan. Mom sighed softly. I had heard that sigh at 17 when I wanted to go to a college 6 hours away. At 26 when I refused to cancel a work trip because Luke had forgotten to book a vendor. At 32, when I asked whether the money I had advanced for Foxfield's pavilion deposit was ever going to be repaid. Mom's sigh always meant the same thing. Why are you making us say out loud that your needs come second? I looked back at the signature page. My hand was steady now. I'm not signing today. Luke stared at me. Mom's face changed first. Not dramatically. Her smile simply disappeared. Dad leaned forward. Nora. No. You haven't even heard the full explanation. That's exactly why I'm not signing. Daniel closed the folder halfway. A small, professional gesture. Neutral. He wasn't rescuing me. He was acknowledging that a signature could not be forced into existence by making the room uncomfortable. Dad stood. We're taking 5 minutes. It wasn't a request. Mom caught me in the hallway before I reached the restroom. Nora. I kept walking. She touched my elbow. Not hard. She never needed force. You knew Foxfield was going to Luke. Yes. So why are you doing this now? I stopped. Doing what? Her eyes flicked toward the conference room door. You know what? No, Mom. Say it. She lowered her voice. Ruining this for him. There it was. Not refusing debt. Not asking questions. Ruining Luke's day. Dad came through the door behind her. He looked older in the hallway light than he had at the table. At 68, Charles Whitmore still carried himself like every room had been built to his measurements, but the gray at his temples had spread over the last few years. For half a second, guilt arrived before he even spoke. That was how well trained I was. Nora, he said, you signed the original guarantee. This is continuity. Nothing more. That was 10 years ago. And you told me it was temporary. His expression hardened. We were in a completely different financial position then. Exactly. Foxfield is stronger now. So why am I still on it? Mom folded her arms. Because families help each other. I looked at Dad. I've asked you about being released before. He gave a short nod as if that proved his point. And every time, I told you we were working toward it. At 39, I could finally admit something. I had spent years dressing up as patience. I had asked. I just had not forced the answer. 3 years after the original refinancing, Dad told me the lender wanted continuity through the next renewal. 2 years after that, he emailed me occupancy numbers, showing the event business growing. The following year, He sent a management summary showing stronger revenue and told me Foxfield's leverage was finally where it should be. Every time I asked when my name would come off, the date moved. After the next renewal, after the new appraisal, after the pavilion season, after one stronger year. And because the loan remained current, because no one called me for money, because Foxfield looked successful from the outside, I let the issue slide down my priority list. That bothered me now. Professionally, I would have called it unacceptable. Personally, I had called it keeping the peace. One last time, Dad said. The hallway disappeared for half a second. Not literally. Just enough for an old memory to lay itself over the present. I was 29, sitting at Dad's kitchen table with a loan packet in front of me. Foxfield had overextended itself, building the first version of the event pavilion. A major booking season had underperformed. Refinancing was tight. Dad had looked exhausted. Mom had been crying quietly. Luke, 25 then, had just started talking about opening his own company and had no meaningful assets to offer. I had a strong salary, clean credit, and the kind of employment history lenders liked. Dad put his hand over mine. One last time, Nora. I signed. Back in the hallway, I looked at him. You said that 10 years ago. He frowned. What? One last time. Mom's voice softened. Nora, nobody forced you. I almost smiled at that. Family guilt had always been most effective when everyone agreed it counted as free choice. I looked at Dad. If Foxfield has been as healthy as the reports you sent me, why haven't you released me? His answer came too fast. Because there was no reason to create unnecessary expense. My financial exposure is unnecessary expense? Nothing ever happened to you. I went still. Dad seemed to hear his own sentence only after it was out. Mom looked away. I repeated it. Nothing ever happened to me. You know what I mean. I did. That was the problem. He meant the loan had never defaulted. He meant nobody had come after my assets. He meant I had never been forced to write a check. Therefore, in his mind, the risk had cost me nothing. 10 years of carrying a contingent obligation. 10 years of explaining it whenever I considered borrowing. 10 years of postponing bigger personal decisions because I never knew how cleanly Foxfield could be separated from my balance sheet. Nothing happened. Because nothing exploded. I looked at the conference room door. What is the new money for? Dad's jaw moved once. It's a refinance. That's not what I asked. Mom stepped between us emotionally, if not physically. We are not doing this in a hallway. Great. Email me the answer. Dad stared at me. I picked up my bag. I'm leaving. You're walking out in the middle of the closing? No. I looked him directly in the eye. I'm walking out before I sign something I haven't reviewed. For once, I didn't apologize before I left. Dad emailed the revised packet at 7:14 that evening. Sign the flagged pages tonight and we can put this behind us. No hello. No explanation. I read the sentence 3 times. Then I made tea, changed out of my work clothes, and carried my laptop to the small dining table in my condo. I had rented the place for 6 years. 2 bedrooms, good light, quiet building, perfectly comfortable. Also not mine. I had looked at townhouses twice in the last 3 years and stopped both times before making an offer. There were reasons. Rates, inventory, timing. At least, those were the reasons I used. The less comfortable reason was sitting in the document open on my screen. Foxfield. I created a blank spreadsheet. 4 columns. It was an old habit from work. Asset. Beneficiary. Risk holder. Exit. Dad once told me I could turn a birthday dinner into a risk matrix if someone gave me enough time. I entered. Asset. Foxfield Estate. Beneficiary. Luke Whitmore. I paused over the 3rd column. Then typed. Risk holder. Nora Whitmore. Exit remained blank. That irritated me more than anything else. Not because I expected an easy answer. Because nobody had bothered to pretend there was one. I returned to the loan packet. The proposed facility was larger than a simple replacement of the existing Foxfield loan. I checked the number twice. Then I found a date in the supporting material. February 12. My hand stopped on the trackpad. Dad had told me in April that he and Mom had recently decided to transfer Foxfield to Luke. February was not recently. February was planning. I opened another document. Valuation work. Also February. I leaned back. My tea had gone untouched. For several minutes, I told myself not to leap ahead. Dates were facts. Motives were not. That distinction mattered to me. It always had. A February document did not prove Dad had lied about everything. It proved the financing process existed before he told me about the transfer. That was enough to keep reading. My phone lit up. Dad calling. I watched it ring. A year ago, I would have answered automatically. 5 years ago, I would have answered before the second ring. The call stopped. 30 seconds later, it started again. I turned the phone face down. The quiet afterward felt unnatural. Then good. I kept reading. Near the back of the packet, I found a section summarizing proposed uses of proceeds, existing Foxfield debt, transaction costs, property-related items, and one line that made me sit forward. Related party obligation. The description underneath was abbreviated. Not enough to tell me exactly what it was. Enough to tell me it wasn't ordinary Foxfield operating debt. The amount beside it was large. Very large. I stared at the figure. My phone buzzed again. Not Dad. Luke. Dad says you're holding up closing. I need to know if this is going to drag past Friday. I read the message twice, then typed. What happens Friday? The typing indicator appeared, disappeared, appeared again, then vanished. No reply. I looked back at the related party line. Then at the February date. Then at my spreadsheet. Asset. Beneficiary. Risk color. Exit. The last box was still empty. For years, Dad had told me Foxfield needed my name because families stood behind each other. That morning, I had assumed the insult was simple. They wanted Luke to own everything while I smiled politely. By midnight, that almost felt innocent. I had spent the entire day wondering why my signature mattered to my brother's inheritance. Now I knew I had been asking the wrong question. The question was, what exactly had my father promised Luke my signature would buy? The next morning, Luke still hadn't answered my question. What happens Friday? His last message sat beneath mine, like an unfinished sentence. Dad had sent 3 more texts after midnight. Call me. We need to clear this up before people start getting the wrong idea. And finally, your brother should not lose Foxfield because you are upset. That last one almost worked. Not because it was true. Because it was familiar. The quickest way to control me had always been to describe someone else's problem as the consequence of my feelings. Luke forgot a vendor deposit. Nora was being inflexible. Mom volunteered me to host relatives while I was working 60-hour weeks. Nora needed to remember what mattered. Dad left my name attached to a commercial guarantee for a decade. Nora was upset. By 7:30, coffee sat beside my keyboard and Foxfield had its own folder on my personal drive. Not a folder Dad could access. Not a shared account. Mine. The first file inside was the packet he had emailed the night before. The second was a document I created myself. 4 columns. Asset, beneficiary, risk holder, exit, Foxfield estate. Luke Whitmore. Nora Whitmore. The last box remained blank. At work, an undefined exit was the kind of thing that made me stop a meeting. A vendor could promise low fees, great service, and 12 months of effortless implementation. But if nobody could explain what happened when the arrangement stopped working, I treated that as part of the price. Somehow, with my own father, I had accepted, we're working on it, as an exit strategy for 10 years. That realization bothered me enough that I closed the spreadsheet for a moment. Not because I thought I had been stupid. That would have been easier. Stupidity was simple. You fixed what you didn't know. I had known enough to ask. The first time had been 3 years after I signed. Dad told me the lender preferred guarantor continuity until the next renewal. The second time, he sent me a management summary showing Foxfield's event revenue had improved. The third time, he pointed to a valuation and said leverage was finally coming down. Every answer had contained just enough truth to make the next argument feel unnecessary. Nothing had defaulted. Nobody had called me for money. The estate kept booking weddings. Luke's equipment company kept growing. And every time I thought about forcing the issue, Dad made the conversation sound like I was threatening stability over paperwork that had never hurt me. Almost there, he would say. Next renewal. Once this season closes. That was the part I understood differently now. He hadn't needed me to forget the guarantee. He had only needed me to keep postponing the moment when I demanded proof that it was over. A meeting notification flashed on my work screen. Vendor continuity review. For the next hour, 3 people presented a proposal for a transportation supplier we were considering adding in Pennsylvania. The supplier looked fine. Strong insurance. Acceptable financials. Good references. Then I got to the termination provisions. What happens if their capacity falls below our minimum during peak season? I asked. The account manager answered first. We'd work with them. For how long? He hesitated. Depends on the circumstances. And if we can't resolve it? Another pause. My pen stopped above the page. There it was. The same sentence in a different suit. We'll work it out. Almost there. Next renewal. After the meeting, my coworker Jenna leaned into my doorway. You just killed their whole pitch with one question. They didn't have an exit. She shrugged. That's why they pay you. After she left, I stared at my closed office door. That's why they pay you. The words had no cruelty in them. That was what made them sting. At work, noticing risk was a skill. At home, the exact same behavior had been treated like a personality defect. Before I could talk myself out of it, I opened the lender's website, found the contact information attached to the existing Foxfield facility, and drafted a short message. No accusations, no theory, no mention of Luke. I identified myself as an existing guarantor and requested copies of any documents related to my current obligation and any proposed continuation, requiring my execution. Then, I pressed send. The moment the email disappeared from my screen, my stomach tightened. Not fear of the bank. Fear of Dad finding out I had asked someone else a question he believed should go through him. That was when I knew the email mattered. 2 hours later, Dana Brooks replied. She introduced herself as the relationship manager assigned to the Foxfield facility and offered a call that afternoon. Her message was careful. She could discuss my own obligation, the documents requiring my signature, and materials I was entitled to receive in that capacity. Nothing else. That was all I needed. At 3 to 10, I shut my office door and called. Miss Whitmore? Dana said. Nora is fine. All right, Nora. I reviewed your request. A faint rustling came through the line. Before we start, I want to be clear about scope. I can talk with you about your current guarantee and about documents that require your execution. I can't discuss the private banking information of other individuals or entities unless that information appears in transaction materials you are entitled to review. That's fine. It was more than fine. I didn't want gossip. I wanted my own name back. Am I still a guarantor on the existing Foxfield facility? Yes. The answer came without drama. Still, my grip tightened around the pen. Was I ever formally released? Not according to the documents I have. I looked out the window at the warehouse roofs beyond our office building. Gray metal. Late morning rain, drying in patches. Nothing in the world had changed. But a promise I had spent years treating like progress had just become what it actually was. A promise. Not a release. What does the new transaction require from me? The current proposal assumes you would execute continuing guarantor documentation tied to the replacement facility. Assumes? Dana paused. The package was structured on the expectation that existing guarantor support would continue. Did anyone tell the bank I had already agreed? I can't characterize private conversations beyond the materials I'm authorized to discuss. Professional. Measured. Then she added, your signature is still required. Nothing in the file substitutes for that. A small amount of pressure left my chest. Not because the answer was comforting. Because it was clean. Nobody could sign for me. Nobody could turn family expectation into legal consent. What's the balance being refinanced? Dana gave me the portion I was entitled to know because it related to the facility I guaranteed. Then she confirmed the proposed new facility was larger. How much larger? She gave me the figure. My pen stopped. The difference was not a rounding error. It was not normal transaction cost. There was additional borrowing. Significant additional borrowing. Can you tell me what the extra amount is for? I can discuss the categories shown in the package requiring your signature. Please do. Part refinances existing Foxfield obligations. There are transaction costs and property-related items. There is also an additional proceeds component, related party. Another brief pause. That category appears in the materials. My pulse slowed instead of speeding up. Whenever the facts got sharper, I got calmer. Can you send me everything I'm entitled to receive? Yes. Directly to me? Yes. Thank you. Before we ended the call, one more question came out. Dana, does the new financing require me because I own part of Foxfield? No. That answer mattered. Does it require me because I have the power to stop my parents from transferring the estate? No. Even better. Then the only reason my signature matters is because the financing has been structured with my continuing support. That's a fair description of your role in the proposed documents. There it was. The inheritance was Luke's. The risk was being assigned to me. Again. After the call, I reopened the matrix. Under exit, I typed, no formal release. New package assumes continuation. The blank box had been bad. The truth was worse. At 5:20, Mom called. For a second, the old reflex reached my hand before my judgment did. I answered. Nora. She sounded tired. Not angry. Mom knew how to use tired better than most people used shouting. Hi, Mom. I want you to come to dinner tomorrow. What for? So we can talk like a family instead of turning everything into emails and loan documents. My mouth nearly formed an apology. It was astonishing how fast that habit arrived. I'm not discussing a financial obligation without a written record. Silence. Then, listen to yourself. I am. Your father is 68 years old. I know. Luke has a company, employees, Rachel, a household, people depending on him. Something inside me sharpened. And, you have more flexibility. There it was. The polite version. Luke had more people depending on him, so I had less right to protect myself. I have a life too. I didn't say you didn't. You said he has people depending on him. He does. And I only have myself. Mom didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. The sentence had already arrived between us. I looked across my condo later that evening and understood something I wished I had noticed years earlier. My independence had never made me freer in my parents' eyes. It made me easier to use. No children meant I could stay late. No spouse meant I could travel when Foxfield needed someone. A stable career meant I could cover an emergency. Good credit meant I could sign. Every responsible decision I made became evidence that I could afford another sacrifice. If Dad wants me to consider something, I said, he can send it. You're making this much harder than it needs to be. Then the documents should make it easy. Nora. I have to go. Mom's voice changed. Not much. Just enough to remove the softness. You know people are going to think you're doing this because Luke got Foxfield. There was the warning beneath the invitation. Not come to dinner because we love you. Come to dinner because we still control the story. People can ask me if they want to know. You know that isn't how families work. Maybe that had been my mistake. I had spent almost 40 years accepting that sentence as a fact. After we hung up, an old memory returned without asking permission. Luke was 27. His first large corporate event was 2 days away, and one of his suppliers had demanded an unexpected deposit before releasing equipment. He called Dad. Dad called me. I had been packing for a professional certification course in Chicago. You can always take the class next session, Dad had said. Luke's event, apparently, existed only once. I changed my flight, covered the deposit, missed the course. Nobody forced me. That phrase again. Nobody forced you. The next year, when I finally completed the certification, Dad congratulated me at dinner. You always land on your feet. As if that were proof the fall had cost nothing. The memory faded when my laptop chimed. Dana's documents had arrived. I opened them one by one. This time, the February date appeared in more than one place. Preliminary valuation request. Facility discussion. Internal transaction references that connected to documents requiring my signature. February. Dad had told me about Luke receiving Foxfield in April. I pulled up his email from 3 weeks earlier. Your mother and I have recently decided the cleanest thing is to pass Foxfield to Luke. Recently, I created another page in my notes. February refinancing activity. April family told me transfer is recent decision. Facts first. Interpretation later. That was how I trusted myself. Next came the questions. I emailed Dad. When did refinancing discussions begin? What category of related party obligation is included in the proposed use of proceeds? Why was my continuing guarantee treated as an assumption before I agreed to it? The reply came 11 minutes later. This is exactly why family business should not be handled by email. Nothing else. No date. No category. No explanation. I read his message twice. Avoiding a question was not proof of guilt, but it was information. Especially when all three questions were simple enough to answer. My phone rang before I could close the laptop. Luke. I let it ring once. Twice. Then answered. What are you doing? He demanded. Reading. You know what I mean. Then say what you mean. You're holding up the refinance. I'm not stopping Dad from giving you Foxfield. That's not the point. The words came fast enough that I sat straighter. No? You know, I can't do anything useful with the property if the financing gets screwed up. Useful. That was an interesting word for $15 million of land and buildings. What happens Friday? I asked. A pause. What? You texted me last night. You said you needed to know if this dragged past Friday. That was nothing. Then why did you ask? Luke exhaled sharply. Because I have a vendor situation. For Foxfield? No. Your company? Another pause. This one longer. I have obligations. So do I. You're not listening. I'm listening very carefully. His voice lowered. If this gets delayed, I might have to make some ugly decisions. What does your business have to do with Foxfield's refinance? That's not what I said. You said Friday. You said a vendor situation. And you just said the financing affects what you can do with the property. Nora, stop interrogating me. Then answer one question. He muttered something I couldn't make out. What question? Why does your company need me to sign Foxfield financing? It doesn't. Then what happens Friday? Another breath. Then, Luke said the sentence that changed the shape of everything. Dad said the refinance would take care of it. Nothing moved in my condo. Not the ceiling fan. Not the blinds. Not even my hand around the phone. Luke kept talking. I mean, eventually, once everything is reorganized, you're twisting this into something it isn't. I didn't answer. Nora? Still nothing. You always do this. You grab one phrase and turn it into a whole case. That almost made me smile. He had spent 35 years being protected from the consequences of details. Of course, details felt hostile to him. I have to go, I said. Are you signing? No. You haven't even. The call ended under my thumb. For a few seconds, guilt washed over me so quickly it felt physical. Luke was my brother. His employees were real people. Rachel was real. Whatever Friday meant was real. That was the dangerous part. Manipulation worked best when the thing you cared about actually mattered. I set the phone on the table and opened my notes. Then I wrote Luke's exact words while they were still fresh. Dad said the refinance would take care of it. No interpretation. No accusation. Just the sentence. Below it, I added the date and time. Then I looked at the open browser tab I had kept minimizing for months. Townhouses. A 2-bedroom place 15 minutes from work had dropped in price the week before. Usually I would have closed the tab. Not tonight. Instead, I sent a request for a preliminary mortgage consultation. Nothing dramatic. No offer. No commitment. Just a question about my own future. What would borrowing look like if Foxfield were no longer attached to me? The confirmation email arrived less than a minute later. I stared at it longer than necessary. For years, every financial question I asked had started with the estate. Could Foxfield afford this? Would Foxfield survive that? Did Dad need help? Could Luke wait? For once, the question had my name in it. The room looked different afterward. Same table. Same cheap ceramic mug. Same stack of mail near the door. But one thing had shifted. Luke thought the dangerous part of our call was telling me about Friday. It wasn't. The dangerous part was what he had said before trying to take it back. Dad said the refinance would take care of it. The mortgage advisor called the next morning at 9:20. By 9:23, Foxfield had followed me into that conversation too. Not because anyone in my family knew I had requested the consultation. Because, when the advisor asked whether I had any contingent liabilities or guarantees outside my regular consumer debt, there was only one honest answer. Yes. What kind? A commercial guarantee tied to a family-owned property. How large? I gave her the approximate exposure connected to the existing facility. There was a brief pause on the line. Not judgment. Calculation. Is it currently performing? Yes. Any history of delinquency? No. Have you been released? Not yet. She asked for documentation if I decided to move forward with a formal application. That kind of obligation doesn't automatically prevent you from qualifying, she said. But underwriters will want clarity around your exposure, whether it can be called, and whether it continues after refinancing. Clarity. That word again. Would removing it improve my borrowing position? It can materially simplify the file, depending on the rest of your profile. She didn't promise me a miracle. No dramatic jump in credit. No instant approval. Just a cleaner financial life. After we ended the call, the townhouse listing remained open on my screen. 2 bedrooms, small patio, a kitchen with plain white cabinets, and enough room for a table that would seat 4 if I ever wanted 4 people there. For years, I had treated homeownership as something I could revisit once the timing was better. Once rates changed. Once inventory improved. Once work slowed down. Once Foxfield stopped needing my name. Only one of those conditions had stayed exactly the same. I closed the listing and opened my notes. For the first time, release from Foxfield was no longer an administrative preference. It had a shape, a kitchen, a mortgage file, a future that had spent years waiting behind someone else's emergency. Dana returned my call later that afternoon. I reviewed the documents you asked about, she said. Can you confirm how the proposed facility is divided? To the extent those categories appear in materials requiring your execution, yes. That careful wording had become familiar. Good. It meant whatever she told me could be tied to something I had a legitimate reason to see. Part of the facility refinances the existing Foxfield obligation, Dana continued. There are property-related costs and transaction expenses. There is also an additional cash-out component. And the related party line? It's included in the transaction materials. Can you tell me whose obligation it is? I can't disclose private account information for another borrower or entity unless it appears in documents you're entitled to receive. That was the answer I expected. What can you tell me? The proposed use category identifies a related party obligation. I can confirm the amount shown in the package. She gave me the figure. My pen stopped. Large enough to matter. Large enough to explain Luke's urgency. Large enough that calling the transaction a simple estate transfer was almost insulting. Does the lender need that money to maintain Foxfield? I can't make that characterization for you. Fair. Does the proposed facility include borrowing beyond what would be required simply to replace the existing Foxfield debt? Yes. That was enough. The bank did not have to tell me Luke was in trouble. Luke had already done that himself. Dad said the refinance would take care of it. I wrote the sentence again beside the number Dana had confirmed. 2 facts. Separate sources. 1 increasingly obvious connection. Still not proof of every motive. But more than enough reason not to sign. Mom texted that evening. Dinner tomorrow, 6:30. No lawyers, no bank people, just us. The phrase just us should have felt reassuring. Instead, I pictured a room where every person already knew what I was supposed to say. I nearly declined. Then I changed my mind. Not because Mom asked. Because refusing every conversation would eventually let Dad describe me as unwilling to listen. Listening was not the same as agreeing. So, at 6:28 the next evening, I walked into my parents' dining room. The signature pages were already on the table. For 1 second, I simply stood there. Mom had set out the blue and white china she used at holidays. Luke sat across from Rachel. Dad was at the head of the table. In front of my usual chair was a neat stack of documents with yellow flags. So much for no bank people. No lawyers. Just us. Sit down, Dad said. I put my bag beside the chair but didn't touch the papers. Rachel smiled at me. It looked strained. Hi, Nora. Hi. Luke didn't bother. Mom carried in a bowl of potatoes as if we were about to discuss vacation plans. We thought this would be easier at home. For whom? I asked. Her hands paused around the serving bowl. Dad tapped the documents. I had the language cleaned up. By whom? Daniel reviewed the revised transaction package. Daniel represents Foxfield. He's competent. That wasn't my question. Luke pushed his chair back slightly. Oh my God. Can we not do this for 3 hours? I sat down. No one is making this take 3 hours. Dad said. Then sign the revised pages. I looked at the first flagged section. Same concept. Different phrasing. Continuing support. Ongoing obligation. No clean exit I could identify on a quick read. Dad. How much of the additional borrowing is going to Luke's company? The room changed. Not loudly. Mom stopped serving. Luke's face tightened. Rachel looked from me to him. Dad leaned back. This is exactly the kind of loaded question I was trying to avoid. It's a number. It is not your place to audit your brother's company. If I'm being asked to guarantee financing that benefits his company, it becomes my place to understand what I'm guaranteeing. Luke stared at me. You're acting like you're the victim here. No. That answer came more easily than I expected. I'm acting like a guarantor. Mom set down the serving spoon. Must everything be so clinical? Yes. When my name is attached to debt. Rachel spoke for the first time since I arrived. What exactly is going to Luke's company? Luke turned toward her. It's not like that. I watched her face. Not what she thought. Not what she knew. Only what I could see. Her eyebrows pulled together. What vendor deadline were you talking about yesterday? She asked. Luke looked at me. That look told me enough about whom he blamed for the question. You called Rachel? No. Rachel's eyes stayed on him. You said something at the office about a vendor deadline. Dad cut in. This is getting completely off track. That sentence did the opposite. It brought everything back into focus, then put it back on track, I said. How much of the cash out is intended for Luke's company? Dad's voice flattened. We are not discussing private business matters at this table. I looked at the yellow flags in front of me. Then my guarantee shouldn't secure private business matters at this table. Mom said my name like a warning. Luke laughed once. You're unbelievable. What part? You've been waiting for a chance to punish me because Foxfield is mine. There it was. The easier story. Jealous sister. Golden brother. One estate. Simple enough for everyone to understand without ever discussing the financing. You can have Foxfield, I said. Luke stopped moving. I'm not contesting the transfer. Then sign. No. His palm hit the table, not hard enough to spill anything, but enough to make the glasses jump. Then you are blocking it. I'm blocking my participation in the financing. That's the same thing. It isn't. Dad's eyes narrowed. The economics are tied together. Your economics are tied together. My consent isn't. Nobody answered that immediately. The smell of roast chicken and rosemary hung over the table. Mom had cooked my favorite dinner. That detail almost made me laugh. She had made food I liked and placed debt beside my plate. When I was younger, I would have mistaken that for care winning over conflict. Now I saw how well comfort could be arranged around pressure. Dad pulled the documents toward himself. Luke has employees depending on him. I know. His company is going through a temporary issue. That's what you're calling it? You don't know enough to call it anything. Then don't ask me to guarantee it. Mom said, you're humiliating your brother. I looked at Luke. He was angry. Rachel was staring at the table. Dad's face had gone rigid. And suddenly the pattern was so obvious I wondered how I had missed it. Luke's company had the problem. Dad had built the financing. My name was required. Yet somehow the humiliation belonged to Luke, because I asked what the money was for. The person demanding clarity had become the person causing the damage. I'm leaving, I said. Dad looked at the untouched plate in front of me. You just got here. I came to talk. You came prepared for me to sign. Nora. No. The word landed without volume. That made it stronger. No signature tonight. I picked up the copy of the packet that had been placed at my seat. Dad reached toward it. That's our draft. It was given to me for signature. He stopped. I slipped it into my bag. Luke muttered, "This is insane." At the front door, Mom followed me. "People are going to hear about this." I put on my coat. "From you?" Her mouth tightened. "You know what I mean." Yes. That was becoming one of the most useful sentences in my vocabulary. Yes. I know exactly what you mean. The first message arrived before I made it home. "Aunt Linda, your mother says there's trouble with Foxfield. Please don't let money destroy the family." The second came 10 minutes later from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in 6 months. "Luke worked his whole life for this. I hope you're not really trying to stop the inheritance." I opened my laptop, typed 3 paragraphs, deleted them, typed 2 more, deleted those too. Finally, I sent the same sentence to both. "I am not contesting Luke's ownership of Foxfield. I am declining to guarantee the proposed financing." Aunt Linda responded with a sad face emoji. My cousin didn't answer. Mom did. "Hiding behind technicalities doesn't change what you're doing." For years, that would have sent me into explanation mode. I would have described the guarantee, the risk, the lender, the history. I would have worked until every person understood my position, because somewhere inside me lived the belief that if people understood, they would be fair. That night, I muted the group chat. Then I did something that had nothing to do with Foxfield. I drove 15 minutes across town and parked in front of the townhouse from the listing. The agent had scheduled a late viewing. Inside, the place was smaller than it looked online. The upstairs hallway was narrow. The second bedroom needed paint. One kitchen cabinet didn't close properly. None of that bothered me. I stood in the kitchen while the agent talked about appliances and association fees. My attention stayed on the table space beside the window. 4 chairs would fit. Maybe 6 if they were narrow. No portrait of Foxfield. No framed photograph of Dad shaking hands at an equestrian fundraiser. No drawer full of emergency checks. No bedroom everyone assumed Luke could use when he was between things. Just a room. The thought that came next was so small I nearly missed it. I could live here. Not hide here. Not recover here. Live. "I'm not ready to make an offer," I told the agent. "That's fine. I just wanted to see it." On the drive home, that sentence stayed with me. I just wanted to see it. A future did not have to be purchased immediately to become real. Sometimes looking at it was enough to stop pretending there was nowhere else to go. The next morning, I sent 2 emails. The first went to Dana. The second went to Daniel. Both were short. I stated that I had not agreed to any continuing guarantee, had not authorized anyone to represent that I would execute future amendments, and expected any document requiring my signature to be sent directly to me. No accusation, no threat, no speech about childhood, just consent, or, more accurately, the absence of it. Dana acknowledged receipt. Daniel responded that he understood my position for purposes of the transaction documents and reminded me again that he represented Foxfield in the transaction, not me, individually. Exactly as it should have been. Dad called less than 5 minutes later. I let it ring, then sent one text. "Please email me about Foxfield financing." His answer came almost immediately. "You know exactly what this does to the family." I read it once. Saved it. Closed the message. That was when the balance shifted. Not dramatically. No judge. No bank officer standing up for me. No one announcing that Dad was wrong. But for the first time, he could no longer treat my signature as something scheduled to happen later. My non-consent now existed outside a conversation. In writing. Attached to a date. That afternoon, Dad finally emailed. He did not answer my earlier questions. Instead, he listed consequences. Without the planned refinancing, Foxfield might have to sell non-core assets. Luke could face layoffs. The transfer could become financially inefficient. The family's long-term estate plan could be damaged. Then came the line he had probably intended as the emotional center. "You can prevent all of this with one signature." My hand rested on the mouse. One signature. One daughter. One solution. Everyone else had limits. Dad's assets were tied to Foxfield. Luke had employees. Mom had Dad's stress to worry about. Rachel had a household. The estate had preservation needs. Only my limit was treated like an act of aggression. I called Dad. He answered on the first ring. Finally. Will you personally guarantee Luke's company? Nothing for a second. Then, that's not how this is structured. That isn't what I asked. My assets are already committed to Foxfield. Will Luke pledge his personal assets? Dad's voice sharpened. You don't understand his business well enough to ask that. Then, why do I understand it well enough to guarantee financing that benefits it? This is bigger than Luke. Then who else is putting personal assets behind it? Another pause. Mom's voice came faintly through the background. I could not make out the words. Dad returned. You are reducing a complicated situation to one technical issue. That's what risk is. Who gets the benefit, who carries the downside, and how they get out. You always do this. Yes. For once, the criticism sounded almost like a compliment. Dad exhaled. If this falls apart and people lose jobs, that is something you're going to have to live with. The old version of me would have answered immediately. I don't want anyone to lose jobs. What can we do? How much do you need? What if I sign for 6 months? Instead, I asked, if Luke's company can only survive because I guarantee debt against Foxfield, is the problem my refusal, or the company? Dad's voice went flat. You've made your position clear. No, I'm making it clear now. What does that mean? It means my signature is not the emergency plan. I ended the call before he could turn the sentence into another argument. That night, I spread everything across my dining table. The February valuation reference, the refinance materials, Dad's April email saying he and Mom had recently decided to transfer Foxfield to Luke, the proposed continuing guarantor documents, the related party use category, my notes from Luke's call. Dad said the refinance would take care of it. Dates first, claims second, interpretation last. February, financing activity. April, announcement of the recent inheritance decision. Now, pressure, for my immediate signature because Luke had a deadline. The order mattered. It didn't prove every private conversation Dad had with Luke. It didn't tell me exactly when Luke first asked for help. It didn't let me climb inside Dad's head. I didn't need any of that. The financial structure was already in motion before my parents told me they had recently decided Luke should receive Foxfield. That fact changed the meaning of the opening scene. Mom smiling. It's all yours. Dad warning me not to make a scene. Luke reaching for the papers. I had thought I was watching favoritism become official. Now I saw something else layered underneath it. A financing plan had been built first. The inheritance ceremony had made that plan easier to sell emotionally. Luke gets the estate. Nora supports the transition. Everyone plays the role they always play. I opened my risk matrix. Asset, Foxfield. Beneficiary, Luke. Risk holder, Nora. Exit. The last box was still waiting. For 10 years, I had filled that space with whatever Dad promised next. Renewal, valuation, better quarter. Later. Almost. My fingers rested on the keyboard. Then I typed one word. No. Not never speak to them again. Not destroy Foxfield. Not take Luke's inheritance. Just no. No undefined continuation. No inherited obligation disguised as loyalty. No future built on the assumption that my competence came with unlimited access to my name. At 7:14 the next morning, Dad emailed. The subject line was, Guarantee, solution. The message contained one sentence. I fixed the problem. Come sign the new version this afternoon. A month earlier, the word fixed would have made me breathe easier. That morning, it made me open a fresh page in my notes. At the top, I wrote one question. What does he think fixed means? Dad's definition of fixed was waiting for me in a conference room at 3:30 that afternoon. The new packet was thinner. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was that Daniel Mercer had placed a yellow legal pad beside his folder instead of the stack of closing tabs from our first meeting. Dad sat at the far end of the table with Mom beside him. Luke was across from them, one ankle bouncing beneath his chair. Nobody had brought champagne this time. I took the empty seat nearest the door. Daniel looked at me before opening the folder. Before we begin, I want to repeat something from our earlier meeting. I represent Foxfield in connection with the ownership transfer and associated transaction documents. I do not represent you personally. I understand. Dad made a small sound of impatience. We all understand. Can we get to the part where the problem is solved? Daniel opened the revised document. The proposed language changes the scope of Miss Whitmore's continuing support. Changes the scope, not removes it. My shoulders loosened. Odd reaction. A week earlier, those words would have scared me. Now they simply confirmed why I had come. What's my maximum exposure? I asked. Dad leaned back. Nora, let Daniel explain it. That is what I'm asking him to do. Daniel turned several pages. The revised guarantee is narrower than the prior version. Certain obligations are excluded, and there are limitations connected to the replacement facility. Dollar limit? He gave me the amount. Lower than before. Still far too high. And when does it end automatically? Daniel paused. There are release conditions. That wasn't my question. Dad rubbed a thumb along the edge of the table. You see why this gets impossible with her? I kept looking at Daniel. What exact event releases me without requiring future lender discretion? Daniel read from the document, then explained it in plain language. The answer depended on several things happening later. Debt reduction. Performance thresholds. Approval of release. In other words, another exit that existed mostly in the future tense. What calendar date ends it? I asked. There isn't a fixed calendar termination date. Dad threw up one hand. There. That's the technical nonsense I'm talking about. Nothing in commercial lending works like your little personal checklist. Some things do. What things? My consent. That stopped him. Only for a second. But enough. Dad leaned forward. The exposure is lower. The language is cleaner. Daniel has spent 2 days getting this into a form that addresses what you complained about. Daniel corrected him, without changing his tone. I reviewed the transaction documents. I did not advise Miss Whitmore on whether the revised terms are appropriate for her. Dad looked at him. Then at me. The tiny correction mattered. Not because Daniel had taken my side. Because he hadn't. He was refusing to let Dad turn neutral transaction work into an endorsement. I slid the packet back an inch. This still makes me a continuing guarantor. Yes, Daniel said. Dad's patience broke around the edges. It's one last time, Nora. There it was. Same words. Same rhythm. 10 years reduced to 4 syllables. One last time. I looked at him. That sentence is how you made 10 years sound temporary. Mom shifted beside him. Nora, that isn't fair. It's accurate. Dad's jaw tightened. This new structure is completely different from what you signed 10 years ago. That's right. For the first time, a small smile almost reached my mouth. That's why the old signature doesn't answer the new question. Luke pushed his chair back. So what do you want? It was the first useful thing anyone in that room had asked me. I reached into my bag and took out one sheet of paper. Dad recognized the format immediately. Oh, for God's sake. 4 columns. I placed it in the center of the table. Foxfield Estate, under asset. Luke Whitmore, under beneficiary. Nora Whitmore, under risk holder. Under exit, 1 word. And foremost. Luke stared at it. What is this supposed to prove? Nothing. It's supposed to make the arrangement simple enough that no one can hide behind complexity. Dad laughed once. You think a $15 million property can be reduced to 4 boxes? No, I think my decision can. I pointed to the first column. You can give Luke Foxfield. Then the second. The refinance produces additional liquidity, tied to what he needs. Then the third. The proposal expects me to keep carrying part of the downside. My finger moved to the last column. And there is no exit I'm willing to accept. Mom spoke carefully. So, this was never really about the inheritance? It isn't about stopping the inheritance. Luke leaned forward. You keep saying that like it changes what you're doing. It changes everything. No, it doesn't. Without the financing, the transfer is worthless. Daniel finally spoke. The ownership transfer and the refinancing can be separated. Doing that may affect timing, debt structure, and economics. But they are not legally identical transactions. Luke looked at him. So I can still get Foxfield? If the transfer documents are otherwise completed and your parents choose to proceed, yes. His eyes came back to me. For the first time since the first meeting, the argument had nowhere easy to hide. I was not taking Foxfield. I was not vetoing the gift. I was refusing to finance the version of the gift Dad had designed. Dad folded his arms. Fine. The word came out flat. Then Luke gets Foxfield with the debt attached, and no cash to stabilize his company. Is that what you want? Nobody moved. Not Mom. Not Luke. Not Daniel. The sentence sat in the center of the room. I didn't need to interpret it. Dad had done that for me. The cash out was tied to Luke's company. Not eventually. Not abstractly. That was what the money was for. I looked at him. No, what I want is for Luke's company to be Luke's responsibility. Dad's face hardened. That sounds very clean when you say it in an office. It is clean. No, Nora, it's selfish. The word used to land in my chest. This time, it landed on the table. Just another claim requiring evidence. Dad tapped the document. Foxfield may have to sell assets if we can't restructure properly. Then restructure differently. We may not be able to preserve everything. That's a business decision. It becomes your decision when you refuse the financing. No. My voice stayed level. My decision is whether I guarantee it. Mom turned toward me. And if Foxfield has to be broken apart? I looked at her. You mean sold in part. You know what I mean. Yes. That phrase had become surprisingly freeing. Then say sold. Mom's mouth tightened. Dad cut in. If we have to sell the pavilion or carve off acreage, people are going to remember why. There it was. Not a financial argument. A memorial plaque for my guilt. I could already hear the future version. Foxfield used to be whole. Then Nora refused. Luke almost lost everything. Dad had to clean up her mess. The old panic rose so quickly I recognized it before it could become obedience. A heat behind my ribs. The need to fix. To offer a smaller guarantee. A shorter term. A compromise nobody else had asked of themselves. I pressed my palm against the edge of the table. Then asked the question that had been waiting since our last call. Will you personally guarantee Luke's company? Dad blinked. That's not relevant. It's exactly relevant. My assets are already tied to Foxfield. Exactly. His expression changed. Not dramatically. His pen stopped moving. That was all. I continued. Your limits are allowed to exist because they're called commitments. Mine are called selfishness. Mom said, nobody said your future doesn't matter. Then stop asking me to put it behind Luke's. Luke scoffed. I'm not asking you to put anything behind me. I looked at him. You asked me to sign. Because it's already been set up. That's not the same as consent. It's not like you're writing a check tomorrow. Dad's sentence from the hallway came back. Nothing ever happened to you. Different speaker. Same logic. If the downside hadn't arrived yet, it apparently didn't count. I picked up the revised packet. For one heartbeat, Dad's face softened. Maybe he thought I was reconsidering. I closed the folder, then placed it in front of Daniel. I'm not signing this. Luke's chair scraped backward. Jesus Christ. Mom whispered my name. Dad said nothing. That was the moment I understood the difference between refusing emotionally and refusing structurally. I had told them no before. At dinner. On the phone. By email. They had treated each no like a temporary mood. This one would become part of the transaction. I stood. Daniel. I'll send written confirmation this afternoon. I'm willing to sign documents necessary to discharge my existing obligation when the current facility is repaid or properly restructured. I will not extend that obligation into a new facility. Daniel nodded once. Understood. Dad looked up at me. If you walk out now, don't pretend you don't know what happens next. I picked up my bag. I know exactly what happens next. For the first time, that did not mean I would prevent it. It meant the people who owned the problem would have to solve it. Dana acknowledged my written refusal at 4:47. Her email contained no celebration, no approval. Just a professional sentence confirming that the proposed facility could not proceed under the same assumptions if required guarantor support was no longer available. Daniel sent a separate acknowledgement concerning the transaction documents. Luke could still receive Foxfield. My parents could still transfer it. The lender could still consider another structure. Nobody had been stopped from owning anything. I had simply removed one asset from the deal. Me. Dad did not call that night. Mom did. I watched her name appear on my phone while I was washing a coffee cup. The ringing stopped. Then started again. I dried my hands before answering. Nora. Her voice was low. Your father is trying to figure out what can be saved. I leaned against the counter. Okay. That's all you have to say? What would you like me to say? He may have to sell the new pavilion. That's his decision. You helped choose the fixtures in that building. The image came immediately. 3 summers earlier. Mom, standing beneath unfinished beams with fabric samples. Dad asking whether the flooring could handle heavy event traffic. Me reading the vendor warranty because nobody else had. I had spent 2 Saturdays helping them. Mom knew exactly which memory to use. It's a building, I said. It represents years of work. So does my career. That is not the same. There. Small sentence. Huge truth. I looked through the kitchen window at parking lot lights coming on below my condo. No, Mom. That's the problem. It was never the same to you. She inhaled. Luke may have to cut employees. Then he needs to make decisions about his company. You really can live with that? The question hurt because I didn't know yet. Not completely. People losing jobs mattered. Foxfield shrinking mattered. Luke failing mattered even if I was angry with him. But caring about an outcome and becoming collateral for it were not the same thing. I'll have to. Mom went quiet. Then said, I don't recognize you anymore. A year earlier, I might have begged her to. Instead, I looked at the drying rack. 1 mug. 1 plate. My own kitchen. I'm starting to. I ended the call gently. Not triumphantly. My hand shook afterward. Freedom, apparently, could feel a lot like grief before it felt like peace. 3 days later, Dad asked all of us to meet at Foxfield. Not Daniel's office. Not my parents' house. The estate itself. I drove through the stone gates just after noon. August light lay flat across the pasture. The main house stood at the end of the drive. Pale brick and dark shutters, unchanged from every childhood memory that mattered. The event pavilion sat beyond the east lawn. Glass walls. Timber frame. Expensive. 3 years old. I parked beside Luke's truck. Inside the study, Dad had spread papers across the desk. Mom stood near the window. Rachel sat on the sofa beside Luke. No food this time. No china. No attempt to make pressure look like hospitality. Dad didn't ask me to sit. The lender will consider a smaller structure, he said. I waited. We can reduce the new borrowing. Luke's face was tight. Dad continued. To do that, we need to bring the existing leverage down. How? I asked. Sell the pavilion, Luke muttered. Which destroys half the growth plan. Dad ignored him. Possibly the pavilion and a small parcel along the south boundary. I looked toward the window. From there, the pavilion roof was visible past the trees. That would reduce Foxfield's debt. Yes. And eliminate the extra cash? Luke stood. That's the part you care about? It's the part that affects what you told me. He came around the coffee table. What I told you? Dad said the refinance would take care of your company problem. His mouth opened, then closed. Dad said, we are not rehashing every conversation. Good. I opened my bag. Then we can use documents. The February chronology went onto the desk first. Next, the use of proceeds page I had received because my signature was required. Then my copy of the continuing guarantor language. Finally, my note from Luke's call. Dad looked at the pages. Your personal notes prove nothing. By themselves, no. I pointed to the dates. But these documents show refinance work started before you told me the transfer was a recent decision. Then the use of proceeds section. This shows the proposed borrowing included related party proceeds beyond Foxfield's existing debt. Then I looked at Luke. And Luke told me you said the refinance would take care of his company problem. Rachel turned toward him. How much? Luke rubbed both hands over his face. Rachel, how much was supposed to go to the company? Dad stepped in. We are not turning this into a public accounting. I almost laughed. There were 5 of us in his study. But to Dad, any room where he didn't control the narrative had become public. I don't need the exact number from Luke, I said. I already know the amount in the transaction category I was asked to guarantee. Mom looked at Dad. I could not tell what she was thinking. I could only see that her eyes stayed on the paper instead of me. Dad straightened. You're acting like we concealed some criminal scheme. No. The word surprised him. So I repeated it. No. I'm not accusing you of a crime. The room quieted. I'm saying you structured a transaction that assumed I would continue carrying risk. You began planning it before you told me Luke was receiving Foxfield. And when I asked questions, you called my signature a formality. Dad's face reddened. Because after everything we have done for you, we had every reason to believe you would stand behind Foxfield. There it was. Not a confession. Something more useful. Expectation. Not consent. Dad had said it plainly enough that I did not need to interpret his private motives. He believed years of helping created an obligation to continue. I closed my folder. That belief is the problem. Luke stared at me. So, congratulations. You proved your point. My company gets nothing. Your company gets what it can finance. You know that's not the same. Yes, for the first time, I did. Dad rubbed his forehead. I'm selling the pavilion. Luke looked at him. You can't be serious. I'm preserving the core property. You said the refinance would solve this. The refinance isn't happening on the old terms. Luke turned toward me. The anger in his face was easy to read. Anything beyond that would have been guessing. You did this. No. My voice was quieter than his. I stopped doing it for you. That was the distinction none of them liked. I had not taken his company apart. I had not taken Foxfield. I had not created the debt. I had removed myself from the mechanism that moved the consequences away from him. Dad looked older standing behind that desk. Not defeated. Not broken. Just forced to choose among his own limits. The pavilion sale will cover enough to reduce the existing balance, he said. We can restructure the remaining estate without Nora's guarantee if the lender approves the revised profile. Luke looked toward the window. What am I supposed to do? Dad's response came after a long pause. Find financing for your company. For a moment, the room felt unfamiliar. Luke had received answers before. Checks. Introductions. Extensions. This time he received a responsibility. I picked up my bag. Mom spoke before I reached the door. So that's it. For today. Dad looked at me. When Foxfield is smaller, remember this was your choice. The sentence followed me all the way to my car, through the gates, down the road, into my condo parking lot. It followed me upstairs while I unlocked my door. For 20 minutes, I sat at my dining table with my phone beside me. Part of me wanted to answer him, to send the timeline again, to explain that he had chosen leverage. Luke had chosen expansion. They had chosen the transfer. The lender had chosen its conditions. I had chosen only my signature. Then I looked at the old savings account on my laptop. For years, I had kept more cash there than I really needed. I called it prudence. But part of it had another purpose. Foxfield emergency. Mom needs something. Luke has a crisis. Dad says one last time. Money waiting for someone else's disaster. My guarantee had not been formally discharged yet, so buying the townhouse still had to wait. That did not mean my life had to. I opened a new savings account. The bank asked for a nickname. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then I typed, home. I transferred the portion of my emergency cushion I had always mentally reserved for them. The confirmation appeared. No fireworks. No applause. Just a number moving from one column of my life to another. Dad's email arrived while I was still looking at the screen. When Foxfield is smaller, remember this was your choice. I read it twice. Then moved it into the folder with the rest of the evidence. After that, I returned to the banking screen. Under the word home, the balance was still there. For once, I let a family crisis remain exactly where it belonged. With the people who had created it, part fem, my name, my risk. Foxfield did get smaller. Not overnight. Not dramatically. There was no foreclosure notice nailed to the gate, no line of moving trucks, no great public collapse for everyone to point at and blame on me. The event pavilion went on the market first. Dad never called to tell me. Mom did. It's listed, she said one Saturday morning. I was standing in the produce aisle of a grocery store with a bag of apples in one hand. The pavilion? What else would I mean? Her voice carried that familiar note as if my asking for clarity were another unnecessary complication. Okay, that's all? I put the apples into my cart. What would you like me to say? That you're sorry. My hand stopped on the cart handle. For not guaranteeing Luke's company? For what this has done to Foxfield? People moved around me with baskets and coffee cups. Somewhere behind the deli counter, a slicer hummed. Normal life. That helped. Dad chose to sell the pavilion rather than keep the larger financing structure, I said. That was his decision. Because you left him no choice. There were choices. Mine was just no longer one of them. Mom exhaled. You can make anything sound reasonable, I almost answered, then stopped. Years ago, that sentence would have dragged me into a 30-minute defense. Numbers, dates, explanations, proof that I was not selfish. Now, I looked at the apples. $3.49 a pound. Something ordinary enough to anchor me. I'm not arguing about this again. You know people are saying you forced your father to sell. I know. Doesn't that bother you? Yes. The answer seemed to surprise her. Maybe because I usually believed boundaries had to feel easy before I was entitled to keep them. It bothers me, I continued. I'm still not changing my decision. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Mom said, I have to go. After the call ended, my chest felt tight. I bought the apples anyway. That became one of the stranger lessons of the next few months. A boundary did not erase grief. It simply stopped grief from signing documents. The pavilion sold. I learned that from an email Dad sent to everyone involved in Foxfield's transition. The message was brief. The sale proceeds would be applied toward the property's debt. A smaller restructuring would follow. The core estate, main house, stables, and most of the acreage would remain together. Luke would still receive control of Foxfield. That mattered to me. Not because I wanted him rewarded, because it made the truth impossible to confuse. I had never tried to take the estate. The thing I had refused was the bailout attached to it. Still, the messages from relatives came. A cousin wrote, sad to hear Charles had to sell part of Foxfield. Such a shame after all those years. Aunt Linda sent, I hope someday everyone can move past this. Life is too short. No one asked what the refinancing had been for. No one asked why my name had been required. The simpler story traveled better. Luke got Foxfield. Nora got angry. Dad had to sell. For a few weeks, I kept opening those messages. Then one evening I realized I was reading them the way I used to read loan documents, searching for the clause that would finally release me. There wasn't one. People who preferred the easy version were allowed to keep it. I did not need to live inside it with them. The next test came from Luke. His name appeared on my phone on a Tuesday night. I considered letting it go to voicemail, then answered. Hey! His voice was flatter than usual. Do you have a minute? A minute. I need advice. My back straightened automatically. There it was. Not a demand. Not yet. Advice. What kind? I'm restructuring some vendor obligations. Foxfield had stopped being the rescue route. Luke's company was finally meeting its own numbers without $15 million of property sitting behind them. What do you need from me? There's a package. I just want someone to look at it. My eyes closed for a second. The old doorway was so familiar I could have walked through it in the dark. First, look. Then, explain. Then, call someone. Then, fix one little thing. Then, stay until the crisis belonged to me too. You need independent professional advice. You do this for a living. Yes. Then why would I pay someone else? There it was. Not cruelty. Entitlement made casual by repetition. Because I do this for my employer. Luke was quiet. I'm your brother. I know. That used to mean something. My fingers curled around the edge of the kitchen counter. It still does. Doesn't sound like it. Being your sister doesn't make me your unpaid risk department. He let out a short laugh. So this is permanent now? The question hit harder than I expected. Permanent. As though protecting myself were a phase he had been waiting to end. Yes, I said. His breathing came through the phone. Then, fine. The call ended. My hand stayed around the phone after the screen went dark. A few minutes later, I started opening my laptop. The reflex was almost comical. Luke had said vendor obligations. Part of my brain had already begun building solutions. Cash flow prioritization, renegotiation, asset sale, payment extension. I shut the computer again. Whatever he decided next, I would know only what he chose to tell me. Months later, Mom mentioned during another call that Luke had sold some excess equipment and closed one underperforming division. She said it like an accusation. He had to let people go. I looked out my window. I'm sorry people lost their jobs. He might not have had to if… Mom, she stopped. That was enough. The crisis had consequences. They were real. So was the fact that I had not created them. In early November, Dana emailed me. The subject line was simple: Foxfield guarantee release. For several seconds, I only stared at it, then opened the attachment. The restructuring of the remaining Foxfield debt had closed. The prior facility had been repaid and replaced. My guarantee had been discharged. No continuing obligation. No future approval condition. No language about another review. Just an effective date. I read it twice. Then once more slowly. 10 years earlier, Dad had said temporary. Now temporary finally had an ending. Dana called later that afternoon. I wanted to make sure you received the discharge documentation, she said. I did. Your obligation under the prior guarantee is terminated as reflected there. Nothing continuing? Not under that facility. I smiled. Thank you. You're welcome. That was it. No congratulations on defeating my father. No speech about courage. Just a professional confirmation that something carrying my name had ended. After the call, I saved the document in 3 places. Then I ordered an updated credit report. Not because I expected fireworks. Getting off a commercial guarantee did not magically rewrite every number overnight. But the next time I spoke with a mortgage advisor, the conversation was different. Cleaner. There was no open Foxfield obligation to explain. No stack of commercial documents to send. No question about whether a lender could someday look to me if someone else's property failed. My advisor reviewed the new file. This is much more straightforward. Straightforward. Maybe that was the word I had wanted all along. What does it do to my borrowing range? I asked. She gave me a revised estimate based on my income, savings, debts, and current underwriting assumptions. Higher than before. Not fantasy money. Not a mansion. Enough. Enough for the townhouse. After the call, I opened the listing again. It was still available. The price had been adjusted once more. The kitchen cabinet still wouldn't close properly. That detail made me want it more. Foxfield had spent my entire childhood teaching me that property had to carry history, names, legacy, expectations. That townhouse carried none of those things. It was simply a place I could choose. I scheduled a second viewing. Dad called the day before I planned to make an offer. His name on my screen still changed my breathing. Less than before, but not nothing. I answered. Hi, Dad. Do you have time to meet? About what? Foxfield. My fingers tightened slightly. The guarantee is discharged. I know. That surprised me. What do you want to discuss? Not everything has to be a transaction, Nora. There was the old pull. A hint that my insistence on specifics was the real injury. I can meet for coffee tomorrow morning. We chose a place halfway between my condo and Foxfield. Public enough that neither of us could fall easily into old roles. Dad arrived before me. He had coffee waiting. Black. He remembered how I took it. That hurt more than forgetting would have. Care and control had never been opposites in my father. That had always made him harder to understand. I sat across from him. For a few minutes, we talked about nothing important. Traffic. Weather. The pavilion buyer. Then Dad wrapped both hands around his cup. Foxfield isn't what it was. No. We lost a good revenue-producing asset. I know. Luke is going to have a harder time making the numbers work. I waited. Dad looked at me. You could have prevented that. There it was. No apology. No acknowledgement that the financing had been designed around my assumed consent. Just a cleaner version of the same charge. You could have guaranteed Luke yourself, I said. His face tightened. We've been through that. Yes. You still think this was about one signature? No. My voice remained quiet. I think that was the first signature I stopped treating like it belonged to you. Dad looked away toward the window. People moved along the sidewalk outside. A woman pushed a stroller. 2 men in construction jackets crossed the street carrying breakfast sandwiches. Dad said, He's your brother. He is. And that means nothing now. It means he's my brother. I paused. It doesn't make his debt mine. Dad rubbed his thumb over the paper sleeve around his cup. So this is how you want us to be? The question sounded almost tired. A version of me from 6 months earlier would have heard an invitation. A chance. Say the right thing, and maybe he'll understand. Maybe Mom will soften. Maybe Luke will admit something. Maybe all this pain can still buy me a seat at the table. That version of me had spent nearly 40 years negotiating with hope. No, I said. Dad looked at me. It's how I'm willing to be treated. His expression barely changed. I did not know whether the sentence reached him. That was no longer my job. We finished the coffee. When I stood, Dad said, "Your mother misses you." I still answer her calls. You know what I mean. Yes. The phrase almost made me smile. I did know. They missed access. Easy access. The Nora who came when summoned. The Nora who stayed until the crisis stopped shaking. The Nora who could be trusted to feel guilty before anyone else felt responsible. Maybe they missed me too. Both things could be true. I did not need to decide which one from a coffee shop. Take care, Dad. He nodded. I left first. 2 weeks later, Mom tested the new boundary. She called just after 7 on a Thursday night. Nora, we have a problem. My body reacted before the rest of me. Shoulders tight, brain awake. The mental checklist started automatically. Money? Hospital? Foxfield? Luke? What happened? Luke has a payment due and something fell through. Already my mind was calculating. How much? What deadline? Who was the creditor? Could it be negotiated? Then I stopped myself. One question, is anyone hurt or unsafe? Mom sounded confused. No. Is someone going to lose housing tonight? No, but that's not. Then Luke can handle his financial problem. Nora. There was disbelief in her voice. He called your father. Your father can't help right now. That doesn't make me next in line. You've become so cold. The word landed. For a second, I saw myself through her eyes. Difficult, clinical, selfish. A daughter with spreadsheets where a heart should be. Then I looked around my condo. Mortgage paperwork lay on the table. The townhouse inspection report sat beside it. A tape measure was still on the floor, because I had been deciding whether my dining table would fit beside the kitchen window. The life I was building had evidence too. No, I said. I've become unavailable for this. How can you say that about your own brother? Because he's 35. He needs help. Then he can ask someone whose job it is to help him restructure his business. You could do it. There it was again. Could. The most dangerous word in my childhood home. Because I could carry something, everyone assumed I should. I'm not doing it. Mom went quiet. I waited. No apology came. None was required. Finally she said, I have nothing else to say. Okay. I ended the call. Then I went back to measuring the kitchen wall. 3 months later, I sat at a desk across from a loan officer with a pen in my hand. The townhouse was mine if I signed the final documents. Not $15 million. Not 200 acres. No stables. No ballroom. No family crest carved into anything. 2 bedrooms. A small patio. 1 stubborn cabinet door the seller had finally repaired. Enough. The loan officer turned another page toward me. Last confirmation. Any outstanding guarantees or contingent liabilities that haven't already been disclosed? My discharge document was already in the file. Still, the question made my hand stop. 10 years. For 10 years, Foxfield had lived inside that sentence, even when no payment was due. Even when Dad said nothing could happen. Even when I convinced myself it was only paperwork. The answer had followed me into every serious decision. Now the line was empty. No. The word felt almost too small. The loan officer nodded. Sign here. My phone buzzed inside my purse. Once. I didn't reach for it. The pen rested between my fingers. My name had appeared on thousands of pages during my career. Reports. Contracts. Reviews. Approvals. And one guarantee that had taught everyone around me the wrong lesson. They thought my signature meant I would always be there to absorb the part nobody else wanted. I lowered the pen. Nora Whitmore. My handwriting looked exactly the same. That surprised me. After everything, I had expected freedom to look different. It didn't. The signature was ordinary. The choice behind it wasn't. My phone buzzed again. Still, I left it in my purse. The loan officer collected the pages. Congratulations. Thank you. Through the office window, late afternoon light stretched across the parking lot. In a few hours, I would unlock a front door that belonged to no one else in my family. There would be boxes. Takeout on the kitchen counter. Probably a fight with the internet company. Ordinary problems. Mine. For the first time in my adult life, my name at the bottom of a page meant only one thing. I had chosen what came next.